Hi guys! Thank you all for tuning in and welcome back to Sewing Lara. In this video we will go over some of the first steps when you start stitching. First I will show you how to thread your needle. And then I will explain what is the ideal length for your thread. I will teach you how to secure the first stitch and how to finish your work with the so-called sew up. And we will also talk about the difference between the right and the wrong side of the fabric. So let's jump right into this. So what you want before you start sewing is to pull the thread through the so-called eye of the needle. Now this is a really big needle. It's really easy to see what the eye is. That's why I'm using it. But we are going to work with a smaller one. So I have here a denim thread, which is quite thick. And that should make it easier for you to see. So what I do recommend is when you have your thread, before you start threading it, always chop a little piece of the thread off, because that way you will make sure that the end is not frayed. A thread is never just a single thing, it's always made of smaller fibers, and when they start fraying, the end would kind of widen. And the smaller the eye of the needle, the more difficult it would be to pull it through. So what I do normally is I grab the needle and hold it a little bit further from myself because my eyesight is pretty crappy. And then I grab the thread a little bit less than an inch at the end and point towards the center. If the thread starts bending, I make the tail that's sticking out a little bit shorter. And then I put it through the eye of the needle, and once a little piece is already sticking through, I immediately grab it and pull it through. Now, sounds sometimes easier than it's actually done, especially if your eyesight is not really great, or if you're working with a needle that has a really small eye. And for that purpose, there's this little thing called a needle threader. So needle threader is this little metal plate, and it has here a loop made of very thin wire. And this thin wire is much easier to pull through the eye of the needle than the thread because it doesn't bend so much. So what you would do is to grab the needle threader, pull it through the eye of the needle. And now you have here a loop that's much bigger than the eye of the needle. And you can put the thread through the loop and then simply pull the needle threader back, and that way your needle will be threaded in a much easier way. I will do it once more. I will zoom in so that you can see it better. Let's do this again. So I chopped off again the end of the thread so that it's not frayed, and I will pull it through the eye. And that's how I threaded it without the needle threader. And now let's do it with the needle threader. So I will pull the needle threader first through the eye of the needle, if I find it. Again, my eyesight is pretty crappy. Now I will pull the thread through the eye of the needle threader, or loop, whatever you want to call it. I will pull it a little bit further through and then go back with the needle threader, and my needle has been threaded. Now, if the end of your thread tends to fray out, what you can do is to make it a little bit wet. So you can have a little cup with fresh water somewhere and always moisten your thumb and an index finger on your leading hand and make it a bit wet. Some people like to lick it, works too. And then it should be easier to pull the end of the thread through the eye. Now that you successfully threaded your needle, you need to cut off the necessary amount of thread for stitching. So the thread that I cut off here, when it's folded in the middle and the needle is in the center, and when I made sure that both ends are equally long, that's about 13.5 inches. There is kind of a rule of thumb. So when you hold the centered needle and you hold the end of the thread on your arm, it usually comes towards your elbow. That's quite a nice length. It's not too little of the thread so that you would make a few stitches and then you would have to start again, but it's also not too long so that it would tangle too much. So anything between like 13 and 15 inches when it's folded is, in my opinion, a really good length. But you have to play with that and see what works for you the best. So the next step is to start stitching. When you do your first stitch, you want the thread to be secured so that it couldn't be pulled out accidentally. And for that, either you do a little so-called sew up first and then you start stitching, or you simply tie the end of your thread, which is what we're gonna do now. So I'm gonna grab the end of the thread and then I will make a loop around one of my fingers. Then I will pull my thumb through like so. It doesn't matter what fingers you use, whatever works for you. The only important thing is that the loop crosses the end of the thread. And now I will pull the thread through the loop, and then I will kind of play with the loop while I'm doing it. Just take your time for that if you're doing this for the first time. And I'm moving the loop towards the end of the thread, and then at some point I pull on it so that I have a tight little knot. And then I grab my scissors and I chop off the tail so that there is only a really tiny tail left. And then I made my knot. So when I grab a piece of fabric and I would pull the needle through, see, nothing can come out. The first stitch would be secured. Another option would be to simply do a sew up. So you would pinch the needle through the fabric and come very closely to the first hole back. You would pull the needle through and you would leave a little tail. Then what I like doing is securing the tail with my thumb, and then I go through the fabric again with the needle once or twice, usually twice, depending on how thick the thread is and how subtle I want this to be. And when I come through with the needle for the last time, I pull the needle only halfway through, and then I grab this end of the thread and I wrap it twice around the needle. It doesn't matter if it's clockwise or counterclockwise, but you have to wrap it. And then I pull on the thread and hold the wrapped section with my thumb. And then I slowly pull the thread out and pull on it tightly, and that way I created my knot directly on the fabric, and now I can chop off this tail. So that would be the sew up at the beginning. And once you're finished with your stitching, you want to do a sew up in order to secure the last stitch. So I'm gonna turn the fabric to the wrong side and I will stitch through a very small place at the end twice. And in this case, it's a very thick fabric and I'm penetrating only the very top layer of the fabric. I'm trying to not make the stitch visible on the right side. And when I come through for the last time, because now I stitched twice through, I will do basically the same that we did at the beginning with the sew up at the beginning. I wrap the thread twice around the needle, pull it through, and then I can cut off the thread, and I did my sew up. If your fabric is thinner and it's really hard to pull through only the top layer of the fabric and you're afraid that the stitches would be visible, you can always simply go back underneath the last stitch with your thread and wrap the thread twice around it and do your sew up here. Basically on the thread, you're not going through the fabric at all, but that way you can secure the last stitch as well. One more thing about threading your needle. You can either, as I like calling it, double thread it, which means you will have the thread pulled through, the needle would be centered, and both ends of the thread would be equally long. So when you would be stitching, you would be stitching with a double thread. Or you can pull on the thread like so, and you would be stitching only with the long end of the thread, and this one would be loose. What you have to keep in mind when you do that, you have to always hold the shorter end with your fingers. So this is how I usually hold my needle. I'm basically securing the loose end between my middle and my ring finger so that it couldn't be accidentally pulled out. And that's always useful whenever you want to have really subtle stitches and you want them to be as thin as possible. If you don't care about how thick the stitches are, or if it's simply more convenient for you, or if you like the way it looks, then you can double thread it and stitch with a double thread. That is, of course, entirely up to you, and it always depends on the project. I personally prefer working with a double threaded needle because it's simply more convenient, and I also find it a little bit more sturdy since the thread is double. But again, there are situations where I need a little bit subtle stitches, so in that cases I would use the single threaded needle, but I try to reduce it because I just don't want to be bothered with this loose end, and I don't want to worry about it being pulled out. And that is all about threading the needle and doing the sew up. One more thing I wanted to mention, fabrics usually have, depending on how they have been woven, right and wrong side, since I already mentioned the term. So the right side is the so-called good side, the nice side, the side that you want to have facing up on the top. So it's very easy to recognize on a piece of denim. The structure of the wrong side is even a little bit different, and even easier to recognize it's on this piece of cotton fabric that has this newspaper print. So that's the right side and that is the wrong side. Then I have here a piece of fabric that looks exactly the same from both sides because it's been differently woven. That's a piece of tartan made of polyester, and when you turn it, you can't really tell which side is which. So that's one more thing I wanted to mention for the beginning. So that is it for this video. I hope that it has been helpful and that you enjoyed watching it. Since this is for complete beginners, I guess you just started out, I am very excited for you. I hope you're gonna have a lot of fun on your sewing and stitching journey. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and happy sewing!